Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network. Welcome back to the show. We're joined once again by our friend Joe Grabas. Again, he's the owner of his own company and genealogist at the Grabas Institute for Continuing Education. He's from Wall Township, New Jersey, but he works with clients all over the world. And we're going to tell you the website. It's continuingeducationnj.com. Welcome back today. How are you?
Oh, very good. Yourself?
Thank you. I'm good. Had a great weekend. I just heard we're getting a little snow. Does that mean you're going to get it a little quicker than us there in New Jersey? Because we're in New York.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm hoping that it avoids us, but I was hoping to get through winter without any snow.
I pray for one snowstorm at least, but yeah, it hasn't happened. Well, welcome back to the show. Please introduce yourself to our listeners before we begin today.
I'm Joe Grabas, and I'm a forensic land title expert, genealogist, and all-around title consultant.
Got it. And now, as far as, getting to know you further, we talked last week about all the years of experience you have. Was it almost like 40 years in the industry? Not
40.
Trying to age you here, but it doesn't look like you could have that much experience. But in the title industry, clearly you're an expert in so many different areas. Would you mind just explaining a little bit about that?
So I actually started right out of high school while I was going to college. So it's been 45 years, and I've gone through a variety of different aspects of the industry, from title research to owning my own title company, owning my own surveying company, and multiple different businesses. But I've always tried to invest myself in what I'm doing and what I'm learning. So it's always constantly a learning process. Today, I spend most of my time teaching lawyers and realtors and insurance people, and working as an expert for various matters of litigation, real property litigation, mostly.
And you offer numerous types of courses on the website. Again, continuingeducationnj.com with really vast knowledge. What did you have in mind for our topic today?
Well, I thought because it's Black History Month, it would be a good opportunity to talk about an area of Black history that is rarely discussed, but is really, really important. And that is the ownership of real estate. To African Americans, especially in the colonial period, and then leading up to the Civil War. In New Jersey, first of all, a lot of people have the misconception that there were no slaves in New Jersey. There were slaves everywhere. Every part of the colonies in the United States, there was slavery, and right from the very beginning. From 1665 on forward. And so it's important to understand how endemic it was and how slave labor fueled the economy of and the development of our nation. And that's a big concept when you think about it. And what would things have been like if we had not had that technically free labor? We may not be the country that we developed into today, but of course it was on the backs of people who didn't want to be there and didn't want to do what they were being forced to do. So I actually write about it in my book, Owning New Jersey, which we call it about 3 chapters on that. And I got involved in that really kind of by accident. I've always been a lover of history, and I got a call back in 1991 asking me to help out an African gentleman named Jake Brown. And he was approaching his 100th birthday, and he was living in a house that he had inherited, and he needed to sell the house in order to move into an assisted living situation. The problem was The house was built by his great grandfather, a former slave, and there were never any deeds transferring the property.
Ah.
So for over 100 and some odd years, the property just passed down from generation to generation to generation. The problem was, and if anyone knows anything about genealogy and just names in general, Brown is a very common name.
Uh-huh.
And the Brown family were very prolific. There was 10 children per every generation. So what happens with genealogy is they call it a family tree. The tree explodes as it goes forward in time. So now what we're dealing with is hundreds of people named Brown trying to find those correct Browns that we could get deeds out of so we could sell the property so Jake could live the rest of his life in comfort and care. And so it was a big project. And while I was doing that project, I found out that, wait a minute, there's a story here. There's a really interesting story about Jake Brown's great grandfather, who's also named Jacob Brown. He was a former slave who had been freed, and he went and bought 8.5 acres of land and subdivided it so that he could create a free Black community in Fairhaven. So he not only created a place for himself and his family, but he created a place for all of these other individuals who were finding their freedom, who were being emancipated at that time, so that they could all live together. And so Fairhaven today is known as a pretty pony upper class community on the Navesink River. But at that time, it was very much the center of a free African American community in New Jersey, one of the earliest ones in New Jersey. And so I said, you know what? Somebody has to tell Jake's story.
Wow.
And that's what I set myself about. It took me until 2014 to finally write my book and tell his story. So it took some time, but it is out there now. And it's a fascinating story.
And can I ask, when were African Americans allowed to actually own property?
So from in 1704, they passed a law that said that they weren't allowed to own property. Even once they were freed, they were not allowed to own property. It wasn't until 1798, so almost 100 years, that they finally were allowed to own property. And it wasn't even an affirmative statement. It was just they revised the law and they left that part out.
Yeah.
Now you can change the law, but it's a lot harder to change the hearts and minds of people. Remembering that every single piece of property in New Jersey was owned by white people. So if a Black person wanted property, they had to go and negotiate with a white person who would allow them to own property. It wasn't a matter of, well, okay, you can own property now, just go out and buy some. It doesn't work that way. The interesting thing is that in Fairhaven, it was part of Shrewsbury at the time, which was a major Quaker community. And the Quakers had a different attitude towards slavery than other individuals did. And they were able to facilitate these land transfers. They had no problem living and working next to them. A lot of it was because they continued to use the free African Americans as labor on their farms, right? Only they had to pay them now, and treat them like, if not equals, at least as though they had a value. And so that was when things really started to change, when the Quakers around the 1768 said, you know what, we can't do this anymore. There were plenty of Quakers who owned slaves, but they said, we can't do this anymore. This is not right. And they started to manumit their slaves. Finally, in 1798, through their efforts, they were able to change the law. Now, like I said, that didn't mean that everybody ran down and bought property.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, one of the reasons that slaves were brought to New Jersey in the first place was because white people got land bonuses for every slave they bought here. So every time you brought a slave here, you got 75 acres of land.
Mm-hmm.
And so now here you have the African Americans who are looking to buy land. Now, that's only the people who are emancipated, which means they were voluntarily freed by their slave owner prior to that. Slavery in New Jersey wouldn't be outlawed until 1804.
Mm-hmm.
So there was still plenty of slavery around. And it was a gradual law. It meant that not every slave was freed. Only children of slaves who were born on or after July 4th, 1804, would be free. Everybody else, they remained a slave.
Huh.
Now, the other thing is that even though they were born on July 4th, 1804, if you were a woman, you had to continue to serve 21 years as in servitude, as an apprentice, if you will, and men had to serve 25 years in an apprenticeship. It was only until they reached the age of 25 years old that men could start to buy property. So 1829 was a really important year. 1829 was the first year that African men could buy property. African women, it should be noted, they got it from both ends, because they were discriminated because they were African American, and they were discriminated because they were women. Women in New Jersey, any woman, any married woman in New Jersey did not gain the right to own property until 1852 under the Married Women's Property Act. Yeah. So that's married white women could not buy property by themselves. So there were a lot of obstacles for African American women in the 19th century. Once they were finally gained their freedom, they still had a difficult time. Now, it's important to understand what happened in 1829, because now these African Americans who had been born free, quote unquote, under the 1804 Act, they were allowed to make money during those 21 and 25 years. Whereas before that, if you were a slave and you were caught with more than $5 in your pocket, you could be whipped on the spot. On the spot. Whoever came upon you, found you with $5, you could be whipped because you were deemed to have been, how'd you get $5? You must have stolen. You were a thief, and so you could be whipped. They had an entire slave code of things that slaves couldn't do and the punishments for them. And they were really horrible, horrible punishments. Things like burning at the stake, that happened here in New Jersey. Whipping, of course, castration. I mean, horrible, horrible things. And most people have no idea that this happened right here in the state of New Jersey. They think, oh, well, we were a northern state. We were the last northern state to free the slaves. Every other northern state had passed an Emancipation Act before New Jersey did. So these are the kind of things that are important to learn about and to understand, because African American history is our history, all of our history, because they were so integral in the development of New Jersey and the United States and what it is today. I mean, most people know about the Civil War. Sure, that was a major conflict within our history, but there's so much more conflict that occurred well before that people are not aware of, revolving around the Black experience in our country.
Wow, I didn't know most of that information, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners probably are enlightened at the moment now. Thank you for sharing all that. Before we continue, Joe, would you mind sharing the best form and all forms of contact for our listeners today?
Sure, you can contact us by phone at 732-261-1013. You can find us on the web at www.forensictitleexpert.com or www.continuingeducationnj.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And by the way, the title of your book again is,
Oh, Owning New Jersey.
and where can we get a copy of it?
You can get it on Amazon, or you can contact us directly, and I'll be happy to sign it for you.
Perfect.
It's
All right.
only $20.
Great. So we're still talking here about Black History Month, and of course, a lot of the unfortunate discrimination that occurred so many years ago in New Jersey. I mean, all over the world. Let's be honest. And you were talking about the Civil Rights Act, right? So that was what, 1968 was
Well,
the final
actually,
end, or no?
there were a lot of Civil Rights Act. The first one was 1857,
Okay.
and then another one in 1879, and so on. Um, you may be familiar with the court case Plessy versus Ferguson, which was separate but equal. That was the Supreme Court said, hey, it's okay to provide services like schools for Black people and keep them segregated as long as it's equal. And of course, in the 1950s, in the case of Brown versus Board of Education, they struck that down, said, no, it can never be equal as long as it's segregated.
Mm-hmm.
So it took, like 100 years for the Supreme Court to change their mind about that.
Mm-hmm.
But the big change came in 1964, the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And that was a sea change at that time because it was very definitive and said you cannot discriminate against people because of race or creed or religion.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't until 1968 that there was another Civil Rights Act in 1968 that said you cannot discriminate against people because of what you call it, because of housing. You can't discriminate them in housing. And that had been going on in New Jersey for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
After the Civil War, people began to place racial restrictions on property. So you could put in your deed, this property can never be owned by a Black person, cannot be owned, cannot be occupied, cannot be leased to a Black person.
Mm-hmm.
Only if they're working as a domestic servant, then they can live in that house. But if they're not working for you, which is a vestige of slavery, quite frankly, then they can't live there. The other thing that's important is it wasn't just African Americans who were discriminated against. A lot of them said no Blacks, Italians, or other undesirables. Um, and I pretty much found racial restrictions against pretty much every ethnic group, okay,
Mm-hmm.
whether it be Christians, whether it be Jewish, whether it be Albanians. You'd
Mm-hmm.
be surprised what you find out there. And that went on right up until the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Wow.
And then they disappeared. They stopped appearing. People stopped putting them in deeds. Now, recently in New Jersey, in November of 2021, the New Jersey legislature, reacting to a growing movement across the country to eliminate these racial restrictions from the various deeds, passed a law that allows you to go back in your title and file a release of those restrictions so that
Oh,
they're no
wow.
longer
Okay.
valid. They're no longer valid under the law,
But
but this would allow you to take an affirmative action to remove the restrictions. Some people were in favor of redacting these restrictions. In other words, going in and actually blacking them out or cutting them out so that you couldn't see them at all. Here's the problem with that. Deeds are history. Every deed is the beginning of one person's journey and the end of another person's journey. And they're like mile markers on the highway. And they're important for us to understand how our ancestors lived and how they thought.
Mm-hmm.
And so you may find in your own chain of title that your great-great-grandfather put a restriction in that said no Jews, blacks, or Italians. That tells you something about that person and about how they thought at that time. The other thing that it does is because they are mile markers, it shows us where we were. Mm-hmm. It shows us where we are, how far we've come, and how much further we need to go.
Got it.
And so we don't want to destroy history. We want to explain it. We want to understand it and try to be better for it. And the land records do that. The land records tell us a lot of information about the history of our families and our country. And it's a source of history that many people don't look to. And that's one of the things I do. That's what my book is all about. It's about looking at how land and land ownership, the most important thing to most people, the American dream, right? Your own home, owning your own home. Person's home is their castle, right? Well, there's a history there, and that history tells us an awful lot.
Wow. Great conversation. We still have 5 minutes left in the show, Joe. What else did you want to add to this?
Well, I think it's important to understand that there's still discrimination that goes on today, something that they call redlining, okay? And that's where you go to a particular community and you say, we're going to either price the homes in a way that people can't afford to buy them. We're going to deny mortgages or lending in a particular area because it's a lower income area or it's a racially diverse area. And so that's all against the law, but it still goes on. Don't think that it doesn't go on surreptitiously. And those are the things that we have to watch out for. Those are the things that we have to be concerned about as we move through life. And me as a title professional, I'm always on the lookout for that sort of thing. What's happened now is I teach continuing education, as I said, to lawyers and realtors. And the laws have been changed now so that every lawyer and every realtor has to take diversity training, fair housing training. And that's one of the things that I teach, one of the classes that I teach.
Got it. Well, by the way, if we want to get involved and sign up for some of your classes, how does it work?
Well, what we do is we provide events for individuals, okay? You're not going to be able to see one of my classes online. That's not the kind of service that I offer. What I offer are live programs where I either come to you in person or by virtually over GoToWebinar, which is the platform we use. It's like Zoom, just like this. And what you call it, you can have us come in and speak to a group of people. I do a lot of stuff for historical groups. I just did something for a historical group in Farmingdale, and they're having me back again because I do a lot of history in addition to the land. It's all connected. It's all, land is history.
Great. Joe Grabas, how do we reach you again?
732-261-1013. ForensicTitleExpert.com or ContinuingEducationNJ.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much for joining us, being here again to pick up a copy of the book. Go to the website as well. Exciting. Congratulations on that as well. By the way, when did the book come out? How many years ago did you write it?
It came out in 2014, which was the 350th anniversary of New Jersey, and that's when I released it.
Do we have plans for book number 2? Is there one
I
already in the
do,
works?
I do. I'm working currently on some additional books, similar in nature, related to land title history. But they're stories. Each chapter is a story. It's not dry at all. I'm talking about people and people's experiences. So check it out.
All right. Thank you again. Have a fantastic day. Pleasure having you here on this beautiful Monday. Good luck with the snow. I just got an update, but they're saying 4 to 6 inches. Is that really
Ooh.
true? We could deal with it. One snowstorm, but then they're saying something about 2, Joe. Oh no, one at the end of the week. I hope not. Joe, pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you for all the information and how informative it was and enlightening. Thank you again. Bye bye.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you now have even more ways to listen live. Check out the MyTuner Radio, online radio box, and Simple Radio apps on iOS and Android, or find us online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com, or search Podcast Business News Network on streama.com and onlineradiobox.com/US. Take your podcast on the go and don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
Mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house. And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned. This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.